Hello, friends, and welcome into our first edition of Talking Trees Live on LinkedIn. I am so excited to be here, and I really urge you guys to join us in the comments and let us know where you're tuning in from. This platform that we use is a little different, that I can't see your comments live, but I will try to respond to you as quickly as possible, and we'll be catching up with your comments. We'll make sure that we either address them on this chat live or that we go back, and if we missed any, that we catch your comments in the chat afterwards, because this live is live now, but you may be watching it after the fact. So we want to make sure to address everyone's comments. So what are we here to talk about today? We're talking to, the reason we're here on LinkedIn Live is because we're doing a talk specifically for you, the tree care professionals. This is not something that consumers or the average Joe on the street needs to know, because they come to us for ice management tips and tricks. So that's what we're here to talk about today, to make sure something like this doesn't happen in your customer's yard. And who do we have here today to join us? We have Cindy Grady. Let me bring in Cindy. Hide this like salt burning. I hope you guys all can see that. Hey, Cindy.
Hi.
I'm so excited to have you today.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Now, speaking of ice management, last time we talked, you guys had some snow in the forecast. Did you get that snow?
We did. We got a nice little dusting, and really just required some salt application. And it melted fairly quickly because the road temps are warm.
Ooh, so that's one little tip about what we're going to talk about today, because when Cindy and I were talking about ice management and some tips and tricks for you, the pros, there are so many different variables, and road temperatures were one of them. And it's not something that ever crossed my mind, but that's why I'm not a pro like you guys. So that's what Cindy's going to really share with us today, is some of those things that you need to make sure that you're doing to up your game and to make sure you stand out from some of the competitors who might not be doing all of the right things. So first, Cindy, you are an expert in ice management and salt application, and that's not something you see every day on the old resume. So how did you get here? What makes, is it where you live, or what makes you one of the experts in these types of techniques?
Well, I mean, I've been in the green industry for 25 years or more, actually more. But, having come from a landscape design background, I've replaced so many plants and repaired so much damage as it relates to salt and overuse for salt. And so by way of just kind of learning through time how salt works and the science behind it, you just become aware. You learn what needs to get done. So, there's so many variables that being an expert is a little bit much, but certainly have a lot of know-how in how it should be applied safely.
Well, I get to say you're the expert. Being humble, you can say, wow, there's still a lot to learn. And maybe you out there think that you also know a lot about ice management. And so we'd love to hear from you some of your tips and tricks as well that we'll share.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I know we're all open to learning new things, and especially the way that the climate is changing. It's unbelievable. So we are live, and we are just getting a comment that people are having a hard time finding us. So maybe Courtney and Lindsay, if you guys could make sure you're sharing this video, maybe to Davey's page, posting it in the links where the other, on the event page, just making sure that everybody has access to it, because we want you guys all to get the maximum tips. And one of my Talking Trees guests, Lou Meyer, an arborist, is tuning in. So I'm seeing some great comments already come in, Cindy.
Oh, great.
So,
hi.
So I saw some stats that I saw this one repeated over and over again, which is a good indication that it might be true. But we both know that 78% of stats are made up on the spot. So nationwide, more than 22 million tons of salt are applied to roads annually. And that's that number is specifically from commercial vehicles. Add to that the number of tons of salt that are spread on private sidewalks, private driveways. That's a lot of salt. And a lot of it let me grab one of these great images, can be done wrong. So a lot of it is not done properly, and that can cause a lot of issues. But tell us why something like this, which might not be done by, a consummate professional like at Davey, what's wrong with a picture like this?
Well, it's an improper coverage. You've got little pockets of salt that's been applied, but it's not gonna. It doesn't have value over the entire space that might need it. As the air temps drop, you're going to have really slick surfaces and then areas with just tons of salt. Not only is that going to eventually run off and end up in our groundwater or on the turf or in their landscape beds, but it's going to create slip and falls in the areas where the salt is not properly covered. Obviously, there'll be tons of coverage in those little pockets, but everywhere else is just going to be a nightmare.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when I look at this picture, I see a lot of this, when I'm out at parking lots, or I see a lot of this haphazard spreading. And to my untrained eye, it doesn't, it looks like it's haphazard, but, I think, well, maybe it will trickle out, or that's done on purpose. Yeah. But this is not right. And
this is not right. It's not ideal, right?
Not ideal. Yeah. So that's what we're going to get into today, is what are the not ideal situations and what are the proper situations, so we can do our best to manage some of those slip and fall or some of those accidents during the winter, which, who knows, it's already freezing. I'm here in Pennsylvania. You're in Minnesota.
Yep.
So it's been cold. And so I'm not going to go out on a limb and predict what kind of winter we're going to have, but if fall already is an indicator, we're going to need a lot of ice management.
Yes.
So first, let's get into the science behind the salt. Now, salt that we put on our road is called rock salt, right? And that's different than our table salt that we might put on our steak. What makes those two salts different?
Well, I mean, the size, bulk salt, rock salt is a bigger size. It can also be treated different ways depending on, what kind of treatment process you have. Generally, it's a calcium, a chlorine or a chloride mix.
Yes.
There's other avenues or other mixes or treatments that you can give to your rock salt, but ultimately that's what's used on our roadways and often our parking lots and drive lanes, finger streets, that sort of thing.
Makes sense. So don't take your salt shaker and go out to your driveway when it's before snow.
Yeah, it'd be out there for a while. Yeah.
So we already got into this a little bit, but why is rock salt and ice management important, especially for a company like Davey? What is it? Why is this an important thing, and it's part of what you do?
Well, applying ice management or having ice management as part of your grounds maintenance contract is helpful. Obviously, we want to minimize any secure or safety issues with, slip and falls and slippery areas. And really, it can be used in that regard, or it can be used to reduce the plowing time or the amount of time that we spend in our equipment plowing the service or plowing the property. Ultimately, it's, bulk salt or rock salt is going to be used primarily on your paved surfaces areas. It's not going to be in your sidewalks. That would be a different salt application. Yeah. I think
that's important.
Yes, it is. It is. But ultimately, we want to reduce any slip and fall liabilities. That's the main reason for it.
And I know I talk to arborists on the tree care side a lot, and choosing a company that's insured, not only is that protecting you when you need tree work in your house, but it's similar for these companies who are hiring Davey to do the ice management on their properties. You're hiring a company that is reputable and educated. I mean, this is one of the services that Davey's providing here, is this type of salt management. So it's really important to provide that, because we don't want anything to happen, but if it does, you've got the backing of a company that's reputable and insured.
Right. Absolutely a critical piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are lots. As we started talking about this, I just have really only knew about the rock salt. And then recently I've started seeing the brine on roadways, which you've told me is not really that recent. But what are the different types of ice management that are out there?
So there are loads from the rock salt that we already talked about to that brine, which is a water salt mix that's applied at before a snow event.
Okay.
And the goal is that it's applied so that it does not allow the ice or the snow to freeze to the roads themselves. So we're preventing that layer from even taking place. There's a lot of, for every salt type, there are restrictions as far as temperatures go, what temperatures they're going to be effective at. And, the application rate obviously will change. And certainly brine and rock salt on our streets is, each will have a completely different application rate and style and timing, and all of the seasonal variables come into play with that, again, with the air temps and the road temps, and the kind of snow you're going to have. If you're going to have a 6-inch snow event, probably putting down liquid is going to be a better option for you than rock salt, but probably not putting any salt down might be a better solution, because you'll just be moving it with the snow. Certainly rock salt is not advisable with the larger depths of snow. But I digress a little bit. Then there's the sidewalk salt, and there's again a whole host of options for that, from just a bagged salt that you would ordinarily use, that you buy from your salt vendor, to pet friendly, and organics, things like that also come with their own set of consequences and instructions and efficacy rates. There's some really good, like, acetate sidewalk salts that's really good for pets and vegetation, but they're terrible with temperatures. And they have far less consequence, but they are far more expensive as well. And then we're back to the bulk salt liquid side. Yeah.
So we're going to talk more about all the variables, because that seems to be one of the most important tricks of the trade here, is that Cindy just listed a couple of them that, depending on, we already talked about the road temperatures. You just talked about the number of inches of snow that you're going to get. So the type of snow, is it going to be freezing rain, or is it going to be fluffy, perfect snowball snow? What is the difference on the type of snow that you get? So we're going to get into those variables, but you just broke down the different types of salt that we can use for different applications. So would someone put a brine or a liquid salt on a sidewalk?
Well, you certainly could, and we do in some of those, like hospitals and things with those, higher incident rates or incident scares, or higher liability activity. That would certainly warrant a brine application or a liquid application. It's might be overkill in many situations, but certainly there's a cost difference, so that has to be considered as well. You could, I guess, is my answer.
Yeah, all depends on the budget.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned this, but there are a lot of improper ways to do this, but salt's like the abundant choice here. We've been doing salt for decades, but we mentioned it needs to be applied properly. So you told me that there's a certification that's available. And so is this something that we should be looking for? What should we be looking for, as a business, if you're going to hire someone to go in there and apply salt on your business, your hospital campus, your college campus? What are the kinds of things you should be looking for?
Well, again, the insurance is critical, and the amount that you have, because that liability is then in that business's hand.
Yes.
And the salt certifications, I know in Minnesota anyway, we have salt certified applicants from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I know there's several others in different states that this is a really beneficial certification. Not only is it does it teach how to use salt for safety measures and things like that, but it can reduce the expenses that you have the following season when you have to reapply or when you have to replace plants and turf, and there's groundwater runoff that, maybe you have to face that depending on your situation. There's certainly some blockage that happens. I've seen that in stormwater management. So your stormwater management system or folks might get involved. There is a science to applying salt and doing it well, getting the safety that you need, managing the budget for the client, and still creating a safe environment. All of these pieces combined are equally important. And the budget itself shouldn't just be related to the amount of salt that's applied, but to the replacement or non-need for the replacements the next season.
Well, so that is this picture that I showed earlier, which is kind of a joke, but shows that there are serious side effects of too much salt or improperly spreading it. So talk to us a little bit about that and why this is so important. That the guy who's just driving down saying, "Hey, I can do it this during a snowstorm," might seem cheaper in the short term, but in the long term, this is the kind of damage that you could have alongside your walkways or the sides of the road. So tell us a little bit about the impact of improperly spreading salt on the surrounding landscape.
Yeah, well, we see it all the time. When we've come in and taken over accounts, we've had to go in and treat certain areas with gypsum, for instance, which changes the soil salinity and allows for water. It reduces the, having the turf and the items there reduces erosion and plant kill, obviously, from, a heavy saline soil. There's so much to be considered. You see this dead stuff on the bottom of shrubs all the time, and there's just no way to recover from that. So now you have that expense to, either look at that aesthetically or replace it. And it's not needed. It's avoidable, I guess, is what I should say, versus not needed. I do understand, wanting to make sure that you're safe, so you put down a ton of salt. I understand that mentality. It doesn't have to be that way, though. You can create a safe environment that doesn't burn the plants that are in place, or the turf, for instance, like in that salt picture. Yeah. But if for some reason there's a reason that the client is expecting a heavy application rate, and you do expect death every year, or you've experienced that, then gypsum can help change that for you. So then at least the expense to the client is not as grand with the gypsum application. Now, it can take time for gypsum to work, and depending on where that salinity is in the soil, you might have to do a couple of applications. In the fall and then again in the spring. But we've had tremendous success with that. And I'm sure most people who've ever used gypsum would say the same, that it really is helpful in reducing the expenses for plant replacement and turf replacement, especially.
That's great. And that's something that a company like Davey, a reputable company, will still be around in the spring to be able to even call to treat for something like that. So if you're tuning in and you're not necessarily an arborist or an ice management person, but you're somebody who hires ice management, these are the things that you want to be thinking about in your budget. Mm-hmm. And is more salt always better, Cindy?
No. Oftentimes, definitely no. Again, I understand the mentality to want, crunch when you walk. I get it, but it really is overkill most of the time. I have not run into a situation yet in, I don't know, what are we at, 20 years now, that would require that level of salting.
Yeah. So either you get a haphazard spraying or spreading, or you get, and we've all seen it, you're walking down a sidewalk to go to one of these convenience stores or get your gas, and it is just thick. It's layered on thick.
Yeah.
So that is a waste of your budget as well.
Yeah.
And so, managing client expectations, are you often able to explain to the client that you are pros at this and that, they should be able to trust your level of salt application?
Yeah. There's ultimately a level of trust that you've got to build anyway. The certification certainly helps a lot. But then, not having slip and falls, that is the ultimate way to build trust.
Yeah.
And if you're doing it right, that shouldn't be a factor. Again, keeping in mind all the variables that are, at play, salt temp, or the road temps, the kind of event you're going to have, air temps, obviously, and lots of little variables.
Well, let's get into that. Let's start talking about variables because you just blew my mind in the prep that we did for this, thinking about all of the different variables. So let's talk a little bit about, just for everyone out there who's listening, who is in ice management. What are some of the variables before a storm, before you outline? And because there's no way you can plan for it, right? You can just say, we will manage your ice. We understand your budget, but how do you even plan for what's going to happen in the winter? So you have to be making these decisions within a couple days of the ice, or the snow, or the forecast. I mean, first let's talk about timeline. I never really thought about that.
Yeah. So we pay here in Minnesota, we pay for a weather service. And then, so 3 times a day, we are given a sheet of information on the upcoming weather. 3
times a day?
Yes, 3 times a day. Which is so helpful because in Minnesota anyway, I don't know if it's like that I know Ohio is, if you experience this, but hour by hour, sometimes minute by minute, things change with the weather. So knowing what to expect, or at least have a semblance so that we can put a plan together, is critical for a successful program. So when we are expecting an ice event or a salt event, or snow, we look at the ground temps. Obviously, the air temps come into play. We can make a plan. For instance, we can make a plan to put down our liquid application in the event that a snow event is coming, and it might be just a little dusting or something. But we know that the air temps and the road temps are dropping, so it's going to require a liquid treatment, or a bulk salt treatment. That could change in moments. So we could be out making a plan to put the salt down, and suddenly now we have 3 inches in an hour. Well, now it doesn't make sense to apply salt. Yeah. So now our whole plan is out the window. So the plan is often minute by minute, or hour by hour. But yeah, we have Davey has what we call a snow captain. So they're monitoring the weather with that 3 times a day documentation that we get from that, the weather service. And then also for, the weather apps and seeing how that's changing based on current conditions versus expected conditions, right? So that it changes regularly.
So the first step in the before prep here is to have a plan, but be willing to be flexible in that plan. And knowing that, again, a company like Davey, if you're out there hiring companies like this, is staying up to the minute. I mean, 3 times a day is incredible. I'm lucky if I look at the weather once a week. And so knowing that you manage that for us, and you staying on top of, okay, here is our plan, but we are ready to pivot. And the most important thing is a successful ice management, not just that we said we would spread salt.
Right.
And that we're going to do it. It's like creating that safe environment for whatever the client, whether it be a hospital. So, okay. So what are some of those before variables? You just listed a couple of them. We've already talked about road temperatures and the amount of snow that we're going to get. What are some of the other, daytime and nighttime, that would affect, I guess, temperatures.
Yes. Temperatures, certainly, whether it's during the day or it's at night, do we have sun melt? Are we going to expect sun melt? If we've got a property that has a tremendous amount of drift, If it's just really well known for drifting, we might not salt ahead of time for that, just because we know it's going to drift all over. It doesn't make sense. We'll just be picking up that salt and moving it, to a stacking location. Or the shady parts will get salt, the sun parts won't, if we've got proper temperatures for that scenario itself.
Another great way to save on budget is you're
right.
only spreading salt where it is needed.
Right. I also have a number of properties where the grade isn't set up properly. So when it was built, it wasn't set up properly. So we have areas on the property that we need to, that we'll need to salt, because if we don't, or if there's nothing there, the water or the ice will just collect in that area and create an unsafe environment. So spot treating, that sort of thing is also important. And we spoke earlier when we were doing this, well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, about looking at your property from a holistic perspective. So when you're on the property, you see these concerns or you see these low spots and act accordingly. And maybe you have a discussion with, your property manager or client or something, and just get an understanding of what the problem is. If the problem is still there based on what it looks like on the surface, maybe there's an additional runoff that you didn't notice, but it looks like a really low spot. But it's right in front of the sidewalk. There's
so much.
There's so much.
Location is a big one, because you and I also, and you mentioned a little bit earlier, talking about plow. And so if a plow is going to come through and push all of this snow, it's going to also be pushing the salt. And depending on what the location of it is, are you in a parking lot, or is it, what did you call them, finger streets?
Yep. Finger streets in an HOA or a homeowners association or a townhome association. Yeah. So, if you are putting in, again, we go back to having too much salt. If you're putting down too much salt and it's not utilized because it's not necessary or it's being overused, then you're just pushing that salt to the end of the run or wherever your stacking location is. You're pushing that salt with the snow into those stacking locations. And oftentimes in many situations, your stacking site is around something that has a tree or some landscaping, a landscape bed of some sort. And so you're just pushing that salt right into these trees and landscape beds. While some of that isn't avoidable, it doesn't have to be just completely detrimental. You don't have to destroy these trees. There are ways of moving snow. Katie, there's so many variables to prevent this, but some are unavoidable. So if you have to stack in those trees and the landscape beds, this might be a great opportunity for the gypsum. It may also be if you've got evergreens or trees down there that are, important to the property. Maybe you give them you try and sell the client a good extra watering in the fall a few times to just get them set up for dormancy and to maybe combat some of that salinity. And then certainly again in the spring, if you can do that.
Well, I love that checklist. So let's keep talking about that, and we'll come back to some of the variables after a storm. So you who are the pros, these are the things that you can put in your budgets or that you need to be thinking of. It's not just the before and, it's a lot. Like you just said, it's so much to get. But so extra watering. So that watering will do what? It will flush the salts out of the soil?
But more so that it'll protect the trees so that they don't pull up as much of that salt when it does melt. So the goal is to reduce the salinity by not putting the salt there if you can. And that's all in your application process. Okay. But since there is some unavoidable nature to that, then yes, watering is going to be helpful for those trees and certainly the plants. There is a significant cost difference in replacing plants versus trees. So if you've got a budget constraint, then maybe just the trees are the way to go, or you can have the closest homeowner do it. But there are ways of not putting the salt there so that it's terribly damaging.
Right.
But yeah, you can recover with some water and gypsum.
Okay. And so quickly, why, I think most professionals out there would know this, but salt does what to plants?
Well, it changes the salinity of the soil.
Besides
So and it burns when it gets onto the foliage itself, then it burns it. And, that is, there's no way to, in evergreens anyway, there's really no way to recover. But we see so much loss to oversalting. In some of our climates, there's no way to get around having to put salt down and
Sure.
burning out plants. There's sometimes just no way to avoid that. But you certainly can reduce the need for the replacements.
Okay. So some watering, gypsum, and an application of gypsum. Now, is this in the fall and the spring, or would it just be a preemptive application?
So, for instance, I had a client that had a bunch of turf damage along a boulevard, and so the boulevard was there's a line of turf between the boulevard and the sidewalk, and that was continuously dying year after year. When we got onto the property, because they're getting salted on the sidewalk and they're getting salted on the street, so it's just getting hammered. And they're city maintained, and cities tend to salt heavily to avoid those liability concerns. But so anyway, when we first started, the first 2 years, when we took over that account, we did gypsum in the fall and in the spring. And then we backed off to see how that would, how the turf would respond. So now we just do the gypsum every fall. Because that was exactly what it needed. And now we've got just beautiful turf between those two in those, that 7-foot boulevard turf space. It's fantastic. It just works. It works like a charm. And that happens over and over again. But when you need the application of gypsum and how much you need is completely variable on the space itself. So you'll need to do some play around with that a little bit, I guess. Makes so sense. There's no hard, fast rule.
Makes sense.
Definitely.
Kind of along the same vein of this before variables we're talking about, you just, when we were talking about pushing the snow and how that could probably push some salt that might have been applied excess or improperly. But also you mentioned something to me about pruning trees. And so if you're out there scouting a site and you notice this is where the plow is going to push the snow and it's a big stand of hemlocks, maybe, right, you could prune those hemlocks to prevent some breakage.
Yeah, I mean, they're certainly going to, depending on the location and the kind of stack size that you need. We see properties, anybody that moves snow has pushed properties into evergreen trees. There's, the architects oftentimes just don't take those items or those concerns into consideration when they're putting these things together, these plants, so the landscape beds together. So yes, you can elevate the canopy of the trees so that they're not impacted as much, or their branching in the canopy are not as impacted by your plow service. Oftentimes, if there's a tree that's in the way of your pile, it's going to break anyway. And then, somebody's going to have to come back out there and prune it. I would say I wouldn't do that unless you've got permission from the client. And certainly there's some variables that you need to take into consideration when you do that as well. I know one of our competitors here in Minnesota this summer, where we had a drought, had elevated the canopy of a spruce, and it just dried up, and that was it within, a month. So there are some considerations in doing that as well. But it's a viable option for preventing damage to those trees.
And it just takes a trained professional to be able to look and assess the situation and say, possibly could we direct, if you own the site and you're telling the plow, here's a better spot. If the snow usually goes here, maybe we could put it here. I don't know if that's possible. Does Davey do plowing, at least we're in your region, or is it mostly ice management? Okay.
Yeah, we do plowing as well. Yeah.
So does the truck do the same? Like, would this truck be doing spreading salt and plowing?
Sometimes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I think in this instance, it would be a combination. Yeah. And yeah, I would say that oftentimes the stacking locations are sort of really crystal clear. And so moving a pile creates a larger expense in labor because, typically that there's a few locations that work. So you just have to make that situation work for you. And when you take all of the pieces into consideration, the trees, the landscaping, how the salt is going to affect that area, I have found that the clients are really appreciative of you trying to be forward thinking.
And like you said earlier, taking a holistic approach, which means you look at the entire landscape. You're assessing what needs to happen before before the storm. And then let's talk a little bit about after the storm. So let's say the storm has passed. Your snow captain is still keeping up with the weather for the next storm, but now there is a layer of snow on the ground. What are some of the variables that might change what you do? Should you have already, I know I just asked two questions, but should it be done and like you wouldn't need to come back out because you already spread the brine or the salt, or is there more management needed after an event?
Yes, after an event, there is oftentimes. So typically what we'll do is move the snow, get it out of the way. If you're not doing a liquid application or it's not a small enough event to warrant a pre-treatment of salt, you would move the snow first, get your full cleanup done, and then come through and do a salting of the walks and of drive lanes, finger streets, what have you, driveways. And again, anytime you're putting salt down, you need to pay attention to your spreader rate. If you're just throwing salt down to throw salt down, then you're probably under or overusing salt. And a great picture of a poor application is that holiday in front of the sidewalk where, yes, it's difficult to see, but you can just see where the spreader wasn't open enough. And so they just got these small tracks that, 8 or 10 tracks that just dropped right onto the ground. So there will be some spreading of this, of course, but ultimately it's only covered in that space. But if they had opened that spreader a little bit, they would have gotten much better coverage. The likelihood for damage to the paved and concrete materials is less because it's not, over time when you're doing that again and again and again, it's just causing more damage. So that's completely unavoidable. When you're coming back afterwards to do salting, make sure that you're doing that with the right spreader rate or the right spreader even.
Yeah. Really good point. Okay. So after the fact, you're going to be wanting to, again, assess temperatures. I'm sure that's the same, right? You want to, you're looking at still your location. That all applies. All of the before things apply, but then afterwards you're clearing the snow and then you're assessing what needs to be applied. Can you apply a liquid salt after a snow? Like let's say you've just plowed. It's not like a fresh or dry surface. Would you be applying a liquid salt then?
You wouldn't want to apply it at that point. No.
Yeah, makes sense to me too.
Yeah.
Are there any other variables afterwards that, the next storm certainly would be a variable. The use, I think, obviously would be a before and after variable, but are there any other things that we're missing that we need to consider when after the storm has passed?
No, all the other variables are still applicable. The biggest one would be when is the next snow event coming? Yep. And are we just back-to-back snow events? Does it make sense then not to do that? We have found that with a higher trigger depth, there's going to be buildup of snow. So what I mean by that is if you've got an HOA or commercial property or what have you that has a 2-inch trigger, oftentimes you'll have many, many people driving over that before you even get to it. So now you have compacted, snow that's going to eventually become ice. And so if you have to apply salt, I don't think you're going to change your strategy much, but you're still going to keep all of those same variables in play. But you're probably going to have less effectiveness, truly. And so that needs to be communicated to the client so they don't have improper expectations of dry pavement, from an ice management standpoint. They're just not going to get that at a 2-inch trigger depth unless we have complete temperature and road temp increase. So
perfect conditions.
Yeah.
We all know that doesn't happen.
What's that?
Having the perfect condition for it to all melt. And
yeah, it's unlikely.
No,
especially during the midseason.
And again, repeating just that a reputable company such as Davey gets that, either has certification, has the proper training to know how to apply it properly to really maximize your budget. I mean, that's what that's what it comes down to. Safety always is the most important thing,
right?
But it's all about money and about making sure that you, in the long run, from a holistic perspective, in all 4 seasons, the landscape is great. So when we're in winter, Davey is also thinking about what's happening in spring and summer too, and in fall, and applying the gypsum. So there's so many great tricks that you gave us today, Cindy. Makes me kind of excited for winter. I'm almost ready.
Well, and I would like to say that I probably have not touched on all of the different tricks. There's certainly so much more out there, but this will get you basics anyway.
It does. And Lou Meyer did share one thing. It was hard to spot all of your comments. So we will make sure to go back and check to see if we missed anything and make sure we address. We really do appreciate everyone tuning in. But Lou, who lives in Maryland, and I don't know if you're familiar, but Maryland has a lot of environmental regulations. And so for the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and he said that there's regulations and certifications that salt applicators, ice management tools people can get in Maryland to make sure that it's not running off into the waterways, because not only does it affect our plants, through the soil, salt leaching into the soil, but can impact the water that we're drinking as well. So it's really important to make sure that safety is the first priority, but that you are hiring a company that spreads salt properly for so many trickle down, literally reasons.
Yeah. Well, and to keep that in mind, a teaspoon of salt will pollute 5 gallons of water. And in Minnesota alone, we're using over 250 tons of salt just in the Twin Cities.
That's incredible.
So, again, statistics, are kind of made up on the spot, but there is a huge percentage of water or salt that gets into our groundwater or that's already remaining in our lakes and streams and stuff. So if we don't change the way we look at salt and how we apply it and look into more of these certifications, we are going to really have some significant damage to, our aquatic life, obviously the plant life in lakes and streams. And in Minnesota with 10,000 lakes, right, that's a significant issue. And I can't imagine that, like Lou said, they're seeing it out there. Otherwise they wouldn't have those pieces in play. Right. But it's a really, really damaging. So if we could all kind of get a handle on it and treat it with the science sort of perspective, it'd be we could make some real changes.
Yeah, because rock salt doesn't have to be the bad guy. I think a lot of times people think it's a problem, but it's actually a problem with the humans, lo and behold, who are applying it improperly. So we can use it. We need to be out there. We need to be getting to our jobs and getting our kids out to school. So let's use it properly. So it can be efficient, environmentally, proper, and it is making us safe all in once, because this is coming. It's coming. So that's for those of you who might live down south, but it's coming. So we need to be prepared. And Cindy, you've helped us today immensely. I know you said you didn't share all the tips, but I think we offered some really great behind the scenes ways for people to get prepared. Whether you are booking someone to manage your ice on a property that you run, or you are managing ice, there's a lot of variables to know. And
a lot of variables.
It's a company that you can trust. So thank you for joining us today. This was
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. It was fun.
It was fun. So while we keep this picture up, we'll say bye to Cindy and thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Bye. Thank you, guys.
And for more helpful information about trees and landscape care, Davey also has a podcast called Talking Trees, and it's available on all your popular podcast apps. And if you're interested in having an arborist out to your property, head to if you happen to be a consumer, or if you want to help have Davey manage your ice and your snow, we'll post a link in how you can contact somebody and find a representative in your area. So please continue to like our page. And if you enjoyed this chat, please share it. And if you know someone who's interested in working with Davey, we'll post a link on how you can get a job as well. Thanks so much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the season. Here comes winter.